China is located in a very specific geographical location. We were always talking about how sustainable the Chinese civilization through thousand years and how different it is from other civilizations who used to be there but finally distinguished. But China still sustained until now. We are still talking about some philosophies that used to be talked about thousands of years ago, which is amazing phenomenon. So the location of China is actually parallel with other civilizations, and all these civilizations are called agricultural civilizations. They are based in a very similar geographical location, which is between latitude 20 to 40. And between these latitudes, we have winters, and we have to prepare for winters. And then, because of this preparation, the social organization, we need a bigger scale of the social organization. However, there are also differences between the different civilizations. The basic difference I quote is kind of very symmetrical but very different. The civilizations around the Mediterranean Sea is what I call natural barrier in civilizations, in which the first location of agriculture is occupied by a natural barrier, which is the Mediterranean Sea, and surrounded by different civilizations. And this Mediterranean Sea, or natural barrier, in the peaceful time is a communication platform. So different civilizations can exchange what they have and what they do not have. However, in wartime, this Mediterranean Sea is actually a kind of barrier which is very difficult to be unified. Which is why Europe, through the history, there are a few times of unification, but finally split or decentralized, not as that in another end of the Eurasian continent. In China is what I call a civilization in a natural barrier, surrounded by all the natural barriers, including the sea, the plateau, the Gobi, the desert. And finally, there's an artificial barrier called the Great Wall. And then the competition between all these civilizations around the Mediterranean Sea actually generates the upgrade and the evolution of civilizations. However, also extinguish most of the civilization over there. But in China, because it's very far away from this competition, actually China can survive from this very harsh competition. However, China is also different from another civilization over there in America, because this civilization is also used to be very much developed. But however, because it's too independent or isolated from the rest of the world, and you can say there's no competition, and finally the civilization just sustained as a war, and finally distinguished by the invasion of Europeans later. So China is in a very specific location in which the competition is not too harsh, and then the isolation is also not too much. And the competition is very far away, but there is a facial invasion from the nomadic people that constantly input fresh blood to the civilization, and finally upgrade the civilization time by time. So let's talk about the natural barrier in civilizations here. Basically, there are three kinds of civilizations around the Mediterranean Sea. The one in the north is Europe, Greek Rome, and the one in the east, the Middle East, the one in the south, North Africa. And then, because the first latitude has been occupied by the natural barrier, the development of agriculture was very imbalanced. And then there's a need to exchange all the different goods. And then this geographical feature has generated an extroversive feature of exchange, which I think is the the quality of the modernization later, because modernization is based on global exchange of the supply and demand, in which in China we don't have this necessary demand to exchange goods between the East and West. So throughout the history, what we had exchanged through the Silk Road is basically gold and something like perfume, and we export silk and tea and porcelain, but we didn't import so much something like food, because we can generate enough food. So from time to time, China enclosed itself because they feel that if the security is not guaranteed, it just enclose itself. But in Europe, if this exchange stops, and then there is war. And then there's much more wars in the western part of the Eurasian continent and then in the eastern part. So this is the situation in China. In the Asian map, China is surrounded by all the natural barriers, and this natural barrier generated the most sustainable civilization by far in history. And inside this barrier, because we talk about this latitude 20 to 40, why it is the best altitude, the best geographical location for agriculture? It's because there is a complementary agricultural economy over there. In between the latitude 30 to 40, most of the agricultural products is what we call dry land product, dry land agriculture, where you can find wheat or the millet. But in between latitude 20 and 30, we can find rice, which is about irrigation agriculture. And this complementary agricultural economy actually means that whether you have water or rain or not, you can have agricultural food in generally. And this actually generates the biggest infrastructure in China in history, which is called Jinghang Big Canal from the south to the north. And this infrastructure actually communicates these two kinds of agricultures in between. And then this agriculture model also generates the demands of the unification, and also generates the big unification civilization, big unification politics in China. Then we should talk about the relationship between the economic model and the social organization. So because agriculture is something that needs sustainable reclamation, sometimes over 100 years and several hundred years. And then there is a need for this sustainability of property. And what had been reclaimed should be turned over to the future generations in one family. And then this model actually generated the most systematic family system in the world also. And this is kind of a clan society, but the systematic way of this clan society is actually most precise and discreetly made. And here you can see a big diagram in normal Chinese peasant family, in which they document who were the ancestors and who are the offsprings. So through the history, all this family pedigree is going on through hundreds to thousands of years. So for example, my wife's family recently had documented a family book, goes back to 800 years ago. But this is very normal. Some families have 2,000 years family pedigree book. So this book actually generates this identity, which is based on local unit, a local society. However, this also generates a very local organization, which is called big family, or we can call clan. And sometimes a clan can be 100 to 1,000 members at the same time. So this is also one typical picture of a peasant family. And then because of this agricultural production model, the production of agriculture is based on the production of population or production of demography. And more human being production, more agricultural production. And then there's a dilemma. most of the Asian agricultural inventions in industrial way is invented for labors, human labors, or animal labors. Human powers, animal powers, instead of machine powers. So here is agricultural machine book, which is very famous in the Song Dynasty, and later was translated into Japanese, and Japanese learned a lot from this book. But most of the inventions in this book is about human power or animal power driven machines instead of machine power driven machines. And this is perhaps why China is the most developed civilization in handicrafts civilization. However, it is not the first one into the Industrial Revolution. And then when there is a natural or artificial crisis taking place, there is overdue labors, and this labor sometimes create a human crisis, humanism crisis, and sometimes because of the disaster take place in China, most of the overdue laborers were going abroad, which generate a global map of Chinatowns. And the Chinatowns you can see now in the world, most of them were generated because of this overdue cheap labor. But sometimes when there is a shortage of the demand in other countries, and then there is a discrimination against this cheap labor. So Chinese migrant workers used to be welcome in the United States when they are hired to construct the Trans-American Railway. But when the railway was constructed, and then all the Chinese were driven out of San Francisco like this. And then because of this crisis, there is a population crisis, which is not like here. Here there's a shortage, and in China there is a overdue. And there is a policy called One China policy, which is actually extension of the planned economy to the demography as a very crucial production factor. So this is actually from the end of the 1980s. And then in the end of the 1970s. And then at the beginning of the 1980s, there was a reform and opening, as you know, in China. And most of this overdue cheap labor was hired in the coastline in a so-called global factory, which is actually global workshop because it is mostly used by the outsourcing industries from developed countries. And actually this is the most competitive factor of the urban China, one of the most competitive factors. But this factor is of course not sustainable, just as here the most competitive production factor here is about resources, oil and gas and mine and rare earth. In China is about cheap level. So I will compare the difference between the production factors between China and Russia later. And then because of this social model, there's a political structure behind this social organization. And then in China, the speciality between the two, between the micro and the macro, is that they're actually very similar to each other. There is a fractal science, a fractal structure between the local structure and the superstructure, and which is called Confucianism. So Confucianism actually treats family as a local level and treats state as a macro level. And then actually Confucianism is a discipline telling people that there is a hierarchy between individual, family, and the state and the whole world. And then actually your ambition goes up when your quality is also going up through the education, either through the state education or through the self-education. And then this fractal science actually resulted in a similar structure between family and state, in which family is a planned society and the state is creating unity politics. So I want to give a very brief compare in between different dynasties of this great unity structure of Chinese politics. So there is a diagram of all these histories. Because it's very long, so it is drawn in a spiral way. But what is interesting is that people were always talking about the unity and the split of China in history. However, we also find out there is actually a big circulation behind all these organizations, all these different political situations. So here I made 5 icons of this situation. The first one is called strong unification, which means use very high power by a very powerful emperor. There is a unification. And then there's a personal sign, but I can translate it into flexible unification, which is actually about there is unification inside, but the margin of this unification is very flexible. Use different tactics or skills or wisdoms, so in which one country, two system. Nowadays you can see in Hong Kong is part of them. And then there's a weak unification, which is about a very weak central government and with relatively strong local government. And there's a partial peace in which local government actually is de facto independence in existing. And finally, there's a troubled time, which is about split it. The whole country is split it, and is sometimes in war. So basically, you can find these 5 different situations from unification to splitism is circulated in China throughout Chinese history. The history goes from 2,200 years ago, and then it's like this. I'm not going to the detail, but actually, if you are very familiar with Chinese history, you find it so ingrained that it's circulating. But I'm going to talk about the circulation in Russian history to my understanding later also, to compare this. And finally, because of this social and political structure, you need to have a sustainable ideology. There is a culture. And this culture in China is Confucius. Of course, there are different cultures in China, including Taoism and Buddhism. But for the social and the political level, this culture is called Confucianism. And the Confucianism, the most essential philosophy of it is about common background with diversified specialities, common background with minor differences, because like this. So this philosophy also appeared itself in a spatial structure. So this is a map of the whole country, which is surrounded by wall, which is called Great Wall. And then this Great Wall actually defined the whole Chinese civilization as an introversive civilization, which is about defense, which is about garrison of the territory, which is supposed to be used by agriculture. And then this is a city. The city is also surrounded by walls, and then there's a family, which is also surrounded by walls. So somebody said it's a walled culture. But this walled culture is actually very discreetly defined in there's a book called the Bible of Right in China. So it's very precisely defined in this book, and throughout thousands of years, it is executed. So, according to Karl Marx, this system is called the relationship between the economic base and the superstructure. And the superstructure is also divided by political superstructure and the cultural superstructure. But what I'm interested in is not about this classification. It's more about the relationship between the geography to the other invisible driving forces, and finally how these driving forces resulted in the artificial landscape. And then there are 2 landscapes. One is natural, another is artificial. Sometimes an artificial landscape failed, and then it is renaturalized. But sometimes it's renaturalized landscape is reclaimed by the artificial forces. And then there's a hybrid or fusion of landscapes. And architects or urban planners are supposed to work on this level. However, the failure of our architecture education is about a very little acknowledging about all these driving forces. And that is especially true in the contemporary world. Now I'm coming to my second topic, which is about compare between China and Russia. So this is the first map I showed just now, which is about urban China in China. Over 600 cities here on this map. But if you count all the county cities, there are over 2,000. However, you can also find out there is a logic in this map, which can be distinguished by this line, cutting the whole territory into two parts. And this line is called Heihe-Tengchong line, in which 6% population is living in 57% of the land on the northwest of China, and over 94% of population is living on the less than 43% of land here in southeast China. So I also find out there is a similar phenomenon here in Russia, although I didn't find a Russian map, a demographic map. I find the USSR map. But I think the situation didn't change a lot, in which I think over 90% of population living in the west and less than 10% of population living in the east. So I'm asking for help if you can give me more detailed data about this. So this balance is about economical balance, geographical economical balance. And then as two biggest land powers in the world, there is also demand to keep the balance in between this disbalance of the economy. The disbalance is realized in the so-called the demography, it's the disbalanced demography, disbalanced urbanization. However, the balance is actually they are in one country. They are all in one country. They are inside one system, defined by one ideology. And then there are big background and minor differences. So that is a similarity between the two land powers in the world. And the interesting thing is that there is a complementary structure in between these two maps, in which the western part of Russia is more developed and eastern part of China is more developed. And they are actually missing each other and you can say mismatching each other and avoid the biggest competition with each other. And then there is a transitional territory in between, which is about the eastern part of Russia and the western part of China. And in between there's a transitional country which is called Mongolia, as you know. And Mongolia is a country, as you can see here, is like this big. However, Mongolia is used to be a civilization, has a big impact to the world, especially to the Eurasian continent. And this dashed line is the original borderline of the Mongolian Empire. However, the second similarity between Russia and China is that the two empires gained its territory from Mongolia, partly, especially Russia. And Russia actually started with the relic of the Mongolian Empire, especially after the collapse of the Mongolian Empire. There is a void in the east, in the Oriental territory, especially in Siberia and in the Far East. And China also used to be small in the Song Dynasty. It used to be as small as this, only this big, to the southern end of the Yangtze River. But after the collapse of the Yuan Dynasty of the Mongolian Empire, China actually gained a much bigger territory in China. So this is a similarity which I call the rebounding expansion after the nomadic invasion. There is a nomadic invasion, and then there is a rebounding expansion of that. So for Russia, it's typically true after Mongolian collapse. But in China, there are several times being invaded by nomadic. And after every time, there's assimilation from the agricultural civilization to the nomadic civilization. And finally, the territory of the empire become bigger and bigger and bigger. So including the Huns in 100 years BC, and Mongolia in the 13th century, and also Manchuria in the 17th century. So this is how Chinese gain the current territory of the country. But the difference is that the expansion after the reclamation of the Siberia and the Far East, most of the expansion is actually about invasive, in search of the outlet to the sea. And China is more about defensive expansion to guarantee the security of the agricultural society. And this difference is actually, I think, is difference between the civilization. We just talk about the civilization of the agriculture, and in China, because of the best attitude for agriculture, so for thousands of years, it is called by Hegel, it is a super stable civilization, super stable political structure and civilization. However, to the western end of the Eurasian continent, because of the best latitude is occupied by a natural barrier, so most of the European countries located between 40 and 60. And this territory is not so good for agriculture, and then there's a demand for exchange. And finally, this exchange demands globalization, regionalization and globalization. And finally, there's a need for expansion when there's a shortage or crisis of this supply and demand. And then Russia is part of this European model. Russia is not part of the Eurasian model, although the eastern part of Russia is located in Russia. It's called Oriental, but actually Russia is a European country, not because Moscow is based in European, but because the whole civilization model is started from this industrial commercial civilization model. So Russian throughout history is searching for the outlets to see. So I want to give a very brief documentation of this search, because I recently went to St. Petersburg and Sochi, to the two outlets of the sea. So the history starts from Peter the Great, from 18th century, and the beginning of 18th century. So the first outlet to the sea is through the Baltic, through the so-called Northern War. I don't know the English translation, the Northern War against Sweden and Finland and the Baltic countries. Russian gained the outlet to the Baltic, and then moved to 1853 to 1856. However, this Russian-Turkey war lasted for over 200 years. But this war, the Crimean War, actually failed. And then Russia turned to Afghanistan in 1846 to 1887, in which Russian actually set up a borderline between British and Russia itself, and also failed to gain access to the sea. And finally, to 1841 to 1905, Russia decided to extend the ambition of this searching of outlet to the Far East, and start to construct the Trans-Siberian Railway. But finally, when the railway was constructed, the Russians also lost the war to Japan over there. So these are all the outlets, all the outlets to the sea, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, Mediterranean Sea, and to the Indian Ocean, and to the Pacific. And then Russia started to fight back from the failure of the Far East back to the Mid-South Europe and to the Balkan in the First World War. And finally, because of all the searching of outlet exhausted the energy of the empire, Russian Empire collapsed in 1918. And this end of expansion is actually the start of the expansion, because Russia Empire started the expansion from Baltic. The symbolic event is taking place in all the three countries, in all the three Baltic countries. But the end of this expansion is also the independence of the three Baltic countries. So the big circulation is that in the Soviet Union time, in 1940, Soviet Union also took over the Baltic three countries, and then moved to 1945, in which the Yalta Conference was launched. Russian decided to support the Kurd power in Iran, and also failed. And then Russia moved to Far East to support or encourage the Korean War, which is fought by North Korean and Chinese to South Korean. But finally it also failed because the line stopped over there, and the Soviet Union didn't succeed to reach the Pacific. And then turn back to the South Middle Europe, to Poland, to Hungary, and finally to Czechoslovak, I don't know how to say English. And then to Afghanistan in 1979. And Afghanistan is another Russian or Soviet Union version of a Vietnam War for United States. And then after 1979, back to 1991, dependence of the Baltic countries, the Soviet Union empire collapsed. So what is coincident here is that between the between the failure of the Russian-Japan War, 1905, to the collapse of the Russian Empire, 1918, there was 13 years. And then between the failure of the Russian-Afghanistan War to the collapse of Soviet Union Empire, there are also 13 years. So this this coincidence actually shows the extreme or the critical point of empire and of land power. Where is the critical point of this land power to the outlet of the sea? So the similarities between Russia and China as a contained land power. And throughout this history, the first part of Russian Empire history is mostly contained by British. So British actually stopped here, although Russia gained the power from Sweden, but the British and the French actually stopped the contained power here. And then again, the British and French contained the power here from the Black Sea. And then here is by the Japanese. So British and the Japanese, actually, these two countries are very similar to each other as the gateway of the outlet of the two ends of Eurasian continent. So here is Britain, here is Japan, but both used to work as a contained sea power to Russian. And also to the Soviet Union time, this contained power was the United States. So this is history as you know. And the difference between Russia and China is that, the similarity between Russia and China here, I want to finish it. China is also contained by all the sea powers. You can see, although China has a very long coastline, but it's actually contained by the so-called first island chains from Japan to Taiwan to the Southeast Asia. And then from another side, there's no outlet to the sea. So China is now constructing high-speed railway from Burma to the Indian Ocean. So that is one way China can gain the outlet to the sea. And this struggle is very similar to what Russia did before. And China also has another possibility to unify Taiwan in the future, in which Taiwan can be the real outlet to Pacific. And now Taiwan is not part of it, and there is a sensitive confrontation between the mainland and Taiwan, so this is not realized yet. However, the difference between Russia and China is that Russia is not a country with direct accessibility to the sea until there is a meltdown of the North Pole. Until this, because now every year the temperature is rising up. However, this is also a potential, but also a risk, because when the whole the coastline of North Pole is melting in the summer, and then the whole northern hemisphere is surrounded by superpowers, including British and the United States, and then here become another frontier for Russia. So this become another frontier, just as China used to confront in 19th century, end of 19th century here. Before that, actually China never confront any big enemy from this side until there is a new infrastructure invented, which is about navigation, the maritime Silk Road constructed here, and then all the European countries come up from this side. And this is what China called the never happened big change, mutation in history for 3,000 years. And then if this North Pole is melted, I think it's actually never happened, big change through 5,000 years maybe. So the real difference between Russia and China is that China still has this possibility to unify Taiwan, so finally to access Pacific. And now this process is going on from economic part to political part. And then the second similarity is that the complementary structure between the more and less. The more means more demography and more urbanization, and the less means less demography and less urbanization. However, this more and less is kind of relative, because less sometimes is more. And here, geographically, you can have resource in a less part. You can have more resource in a less part. For example, the oil, gas, mine, and rare earth is mostly found in this part. And now the western part of the western part of Russia, especially in the Caspian Sea, has been fully exploited almost, and is almost saturated. But the Eastern Siberia, Western Siberia, and also Far East are much less exploited, which means that in future, less is totally more for Russia. And geopolitically, the location is also important for Russia because it's connecting the two ends of the Eurasian continent. And it's also the potential outlet to Pacific. Of course, this outlet here in Kuril Island recently has gained a lot of sensitive confrontation between Russia and Japan. And finally, it's also access to the North Pole here, to the future outlet to the sea. So for China, it's also very similar. Most of the resources of China is also come up from the northwest, oil, gas, mine, rare earths. And the location, geopolitically, it is the gateway to the Silk Road, to the Central Asia, and then finally to the Middle East, to the East Europe, and finally to London. And then it's also the access to the Third Pole. Third Pole is actually the term for Tibet Plateau, because this is too high, over 8,848 meters. So it's very high as another pole in the world. And it's the peak of the world, and it's also the peak of Eurasian continent. So this location is super important because it's on one side is a very economical, useful gateway. On the other side is very geopolitically important high point to guarantee the security of China from this side. So because of this complementary structure between the East and West, between Russia and China, between the East and the West part of Russia and China, and then there's infrastructure linking the two parts. And this infrastructure is also very similar because they are not only linking the two parts, but also going through a very ancient passage through the agricultural valley from the west to the east and from east to the west. And it is a natural corridor in between the more and the less for the two countries. So here I made a diagram to show the logic of infrastructure. So basically, infrastructure is supposed to be a link between the two different systems of supply-demand in which they can exchange what they have and what they have. And actually, it is more important that what they generated through the passage. So if the infrastructure, the passive infrastructure is chosen this passage, what they have passed through is generated, and the geopolitical location, the value of the geopolitical location is increased. So there's another third point for this infrastructure. So this is very true for the for the ancient Silk Road between the eastern end of Eurasian continent and western end, in which the intermediaries, including Central Asia, India, and the Middle East, especially Central Asia and the Middle East, where you can find less resources before they can use petrol, right? And when you have less resources, you have to make yourself as an exchanger, as an intermediator of resources, so they become the best merchants in history. So this selection of the ancient Silk Road actually generated several Asian civilizations here. And another important thing about infrastructure is about the competition. The competition between the different performances of infrastructure, including distance, speed, volume, and price and stability. So if you can prove that you can have a shorter distance or faster speed or bigger volume or cheaper price or better stability, actually this infrastructure is more competitive. And then better infrastructure sometimes choose a different passage, choose a different side. And then different side actually generate different geopolitical location. And then there's going up and going down. Here the original cities are shrinking, and here the new cities are uprising. And that is very true when the Maritime Silk Road was discovered through around the Africa first, and then through the Suez Channel, through the Red Sea secondly. And then there are a series of new geopolitical locations generated. And this difference is called the difference between the land power and the sea power. And this is a map of the sea power. And this map actually shows the different geopolitical locations in the global map, in which they are apparently disconnected by the continent, but they are connected by the sea. And then who has the best infrastructure facility of the sea, who has this power. So firstly, they are the British, and then Japan, and then United States. And then one reason that Soviet Union lost the Cold War is because this failure of the land power in enclosure of their sea powers, including United States, including British and Japanese. And Japanese used to be the enemy, but later an enemy of Russia, but enemy of the United States, but later become a friend of the United States. And that is why Soviet Union actually has less and less advantage in this competition. Another reason is, of course, the neighborhoods. The sea power has much less neighborhoods because of the natural barrier, as it's very similar to the Mediterranean Sea in history. But for the land power, it has much more neighborhoods, and the geopolitical situation is quite difficult to maintain. And it's also part of the responsibility to keep this stability of all the neighborhoods. So for Russia, now, there are altogether 14 neighborhoods. And all these 14 neighborhoods actually are located on the continent. And then 2 others, including Japan and the United States, are actually to the other side of the sea. But for China, it's also very similar. China has 14 neighborhoods also around its continent. But the sea power, or the sea neighborhood is more. There are altogether, I think there are 6 sea neighborhoods. So on this side, China is more complicated. In which you can read a recent event in the South Sea of China. It's very sensitive between all the sea neighborhood between Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Indonesia and China, and which United States also coming up. So the land power has to pay more responsibility and more risk to maintain the whole land power. That is why manpower is more difficult to be maintained, but it's also why manpower is more ambitious compared to sea power. And recently, the infrastructure also changed.